Hey guys, Brian Schultz here with Falcon Kayak, and I am standing in front of the very first set of full-size single-bladed solo canoes that I've built using the same system that I've developed to make my smaller nesting skin-on-frame pack canoes. Now, the idea behind these larger boats here was not to try to create a perfect single-bladed canoe completely from scratch. It was to take the systems that we've developed for making the smaller pack canoe shape and scale them up and see if it turned into a decent full-size canoe. Now, the difference between what I ended up with here and what you might want for a larger full-size canoe is I feel like these canoes ended up a little bit too shallow, and they also don't have tumble home. Now, that has to do with a design constraint and also design choice. Starting with the choice part of it, the reason I don't have tumble home in any of my little canoe designs right now is the fact that these are designed to nest into each other. So just like the smaller canoes, I can take the seat out of this larger canoe and I can put this canoe inside of it, which is great for storage, it's great for transport. It's also great if you need to ship these for really long distances. Now, as far as the depth problem goes, of all the versatility in this system that I've worked out, meaning that unlike any other boat design where you normally have a set of plans and a set of fixed parameters that you have to follow, this is a system, meaning that you can change the width, you can change the length, you can change the shear, you can change the rocker, you can change the hull shaping. But the one thing I haven't figured out how to predictably change yet is the depth of the canoe proportional to the width of the canoe. This entire system presently is dependent on a fixed depth to beam ratio, and that's perfect if you're talking about smaller pack canoe sizes, because if you get into a narrow pack canoe, you've got a canoe that's about 9.5 inches deep, that's perfect. You get into a little bit wider one, you got one that's about 10.5 inches deep, that's also perfect. But if you try to apply that same system to a full-size canoe like this, you end up with a canoe that's only about 10.5 inches deep or 10.75 inches deep when it's 30 inches wide, which in my opinion is just a little bit too shallow. So I guess the big question here is, does having a canoe that doesn't have tumble home on the sides and is also just a little bit shallower than I might want it to be mean that I can't use this building system to make a good full-size canoe? And my feeling about that is that given that you can change every other variable, I imagine that there is some combination of width, rocker, shear, hull shaping, and length that's going to allow me to make a decent full-size single-bladed canoe using this system. Now, the problem is we're not going to know what that is until we build a lot more boats. And that's kind of both the blessing and the curse of what I do here at Falcon Kayak, is that I have really high standards for anything that I release as an official Falcon Kayak design, which means that generally I need to build at least 20 of a boat, 20 different ones in different sizes and different shapes before I feel really comfortable talking about anything with authority. But the idea behind what I'm doing right now with creating the videos and the plans early and releasing the whole thing as a beta test after I've only built 12 or 13 of these different canoes is that it gives people that are interested in helping me with that design experiment a chance to get in on the ground floor for a lot less money than what these are going to ultimately cost. And people that are interested in taking the system that I've created to build these pack canoes and apply them to full-size canoes can build them and give me their feedback. And I'm really hoping to get these into the hands of some experienced single-bladed canoers so they can paddle them and they can tell me their impressions of what kind of a canoe this system is creating, and also their ideas for what sort of things we might change to make them better and better as we kind of narrow in on a really good set of canoe designs. So you've just heard me talk a lot in the abstract and kind of conceptually about these canoes, but I want to kind of bring things back to reality here and talk about some numbers as far as what size these are and how much they actually weigh, and also talk about some of the things that I learned building these boats and some of the changes that I'm going to be making based on what I learned from building these boats. So first off, this boat here is the smaller of the two boats. This boat is 30 inches wide by 13 foot 4 inches long by 10.75 inches deep. It weighs 29 pounds with the seat installed. And the larger one here is 14 feet long by 32 inches wide by 11.5 inches deep, and it weighs 31 pounds with the seat installed. And none of that is particularly surprising. These are about 1/3 bigger than the pack canoes that I've been building, which means that they weigh about 1/3 more. So nothing surprising there. Now, as far as what I learned from these canoes, I learned kind of what I could get away with as far as the geometry for the nesting canoes to start out with. And this is a little bit different than the pack canoes. Now the pack canoes started out nesting pretty loosely because I was paranoid about getting them to nest cleanly. And every iteration of pack canoes that I've been doing, I've been making the nesting geometry tighter and tighter, which is really useful because it narrows the targeted displacement between those closer to each other. So if you have two people that want to paddle that are closer in displacement, you don't end up with two canoes that are really inappropriately sized to each paddler. Now for the bigger canoes here, like the full-size canoes, these have to be nested with a consideration for the seat mounting blocks, which take up a little bit of room on the inside of the gunnels. And what I've been doing lately for both the pack canoes and now for these larger canoes is just going for a perfect nest, meaning that it's a zero clearance slide between the top canoe and the bottom of the canoe, which surprisingly actually works out really well. Now, the one thing that didn't work out really well, and it kind of shows you how kind of finicky the system is that I added 1/8 of an inch to each stem here with the idea that I would extend the cutwater slightly. And what that did is it kind of interfered with the nesting in the front and the back here. And all I had to do was shave off a little bit of wood and everything dropped together perfectly. But it let me know that I was coming up against a limit there. So a lot of what I'm learning is just the limits of how closely I can fit these to each other and still have them nest nice and cleanly. Now, the other thing that I learned is that I just wanted to add an extra stringer to the larger canoes. Now, this is something I was planning on doing the whole time, so I guess that's not something I learned, it's just something I did. So I've got 5 stringers per size here. You could probably get away with 4 stringers, and I'm not sure it would really affect the performance of it, but I find that when I get into a larger canoe and I don't put enough stringers on, I just end up feeling guilty later every time I see kind of the hard faceted look of it. And I feel like the extra time you spend to put an extra set of stringers on really makes the boat stronger and also makes it a lot more elegant looking. So a few more stringers as well. So the other thing I learned here really has to do with the rib bending system that I've been working on. And the way that this is different from any other skin-on-frame canoe design is generally when people build skin-on-frame canoes, what they do is they build a mold and then they wrap it with stringers and then they bend the ribs into the stringered mold and then they sandwich those ribs with an in-whale, out-whale system and cut them off flush at the top of the gunnels. And there is nothing wrong with doing that. I've built plenty of boats that way. It definitely has its ups and downs because like anything when you're working with skin on frame, if you're building something with forms in place and then you take the forms out later, the boat tends to change shape over time. Now, this doesn't mean that that's going to happen to every skin on frame canoe that's built over a mold. It just means that you have to build a few of them to learn what tensions that you need to build into it initially so you don't end up with a canoe with an ugly shape or an unintended hull shape or the worst thing, which is a hogged keel. Now, in contrast to that, the system that I'm using here is more like how I build skin-on-frame kayaks. I've got a solid gunnel here with mortises in the bottom, and the gunnel is laminated, which really helps it to hold both the shear and helps it to hold the rocker, which helps to once again prevent that hogging effect. But it also gives you a nice solid surface that acts as a mounting surface, which is nice for the catamaran systems that I've been developing and also just for attachment points for just about anything you might want. But the downside of that is that you have to know what length the ribs are going to be before you put them into the canoe. And this is the tricky part of what I do, which is developing proportional systems that will allow someone to take any length or any width of canoe and still be able to come up with the lengths for the ribs and have everything bend in perfectly nice and cleanly, free bending it, which means not bending it over a mold. And the reason that I do that is because it is so much faster than building a big mold in your living room. It literally takes me an hour to cut all the ribs for the canoe to size, and it takes me another 20 minutes to steam all the ribs into a full-size canoe like this. So that's a half a day of work as opposed to 2 or 3 days of work or even a week or more doing it over a mold. But the problem with it is it's not easy to come up with those systems, and it's been especially challenging with these canoes because not only do I have to come up with a proportional system that gives me the shaping that I'm looking for at the midpoints, towards the middle, and also towards the ends of the canoe, I have to compensate for the shear line, I have to compensate for the rocker line as well, and I have to create a system that will work with different rockers and with different shears, and I've got to package it all in a really clean, easy to understand, teachable format that I can give to people that's not going to totally overwhelm somebody or drive them crazy. And I've managed to do that. I've actually created a good, simple, stable, clean system and all the instructional materials that go with it for the pack canoe design for creating this basic hull shape, which is a pretty good canoe hull shape. But the problem there is the word pretty good. Now, in a pack canoe, it makes no difference, but as I scaled this up into a full-size canoe, I noticed something that's been bugging me about this particular hull shaping system is that the system that I'm using is coming up with a hull shape that is slightly too slack in the center, perfect at the ends, and slightly too full in the midsection. And I understand why that's happening, and I understand what I need to do to change it. It's just I've been reluctant to do it because the effect is so minor that it's one of those things where, do I really want to throw out everything I've done, start over completely from scratch to make a change that's that small? And I wasn't going to do it, but then I finished these full-size canoes and I looked how the system came together on a larger scale where I could really see the discrepancies better. And I kind of rethought that whole idea. So even though it's kind of a giant pain in the ass, what I'm going to do is once I get these canoes out of the living room here, I'm going to start over with a brand new canoe that's going to be, I think, what I'm going to call the ideal canoe for me, given everything that I've learned building these canoes this summer. I'm going to apply that new system to it, and if I like this system better than this system, I'm going to change all the instructional materials that I just created, both video and paper plans, so it can be released with the new system instead of the old system. So who knows how that's going to shake out? Stay tuned for that. Other things with this canoe, the seating arrangement is something that I didn't really have any experience with, and I didn't know how it was going to come together, because typically what you do with skin-on-frame canoes that are built in the form method that I talked about is that you're lashing an in-whale on there and you're having the seats go on top of that, and there's nothing wrong with that. Completely fine. It's not illegal in any states as far as I know. It makes a good canoe, but it's not compatible with the nesting system that I've been creating here. So the system that I use for this that seems to work really awesome is that I suspended the seat from the gunnels. And this is the huge advantage of having those thicker full-size gunnels that I've worked on right here, is it gives me a mounting point where all I had to do was glue a small block to the inside of the gunnel, drill some holes down through it, and I could hang the canoe seat under it just like you would have in any standard canoe. And I was also able to add spacer blocks so I could bring the seat up or down to kind of mess with the stability or the height of that to be used as a seat or even as a kneeling thwart as well. So learned a lot putting the seats in this as well. So the last thing I learned on these that was really important has to do with the balanced tension between the ribs and the gunnels, because the other big challenge in addition to the rib length system for this particular canoe was getting the right balance between the strength of the ribs and the strength of the gunnels. So the compression of the gunnels is perfectly balanced by the outward thrust of the ribs. And my big concern during this entire process of creating this was, one, that I wasn't going to be able to do it, but even after I learned how to do it, that it was going to be such a precise thing that I wasn't going to be able to have other people do it reproducibly, because they'd be working with different wood species with different strength and different flex and different tension characteristics. And what I learned on these particular canoes, I learned quite by accident, which is that that doesn't need to be as perfect as I thought it needed to be for this to come out well. Now with these canoes, I made the ribs thicker, and to counteract that, I made the gunnels a little bit thicker as well. And I was completely guessing on my dimensions there, because there's no way to figure it out. Maybe there is, but no way that I can figure it out. And what I ended up with was gunnels that were flexing way harder than I wanted them to, and they were really pushing the ribs in when I took the temporary spreaders out of the canoe. And at that point, I was totally committed, so I'm like, well, I've got to put a skin on this thing. So I put my spreader back in the middle of the canoe. I went ahead and skinned it using my normal skin system, and when everything was all said and done, it still ended up in balanced tension. And the takeaway point there is that as long as you're using a good, strong, well-tightening skin, like the Extra Tough I used from Corey Friedman at Skin Boat School, it has the ability to resist a pretty dramatic amount of tension if the gunnels end up being too tight. So this is good because it allows me to release this system to people and feel confident they're going to be able to create these balanced tension canoes the same way that I've been able to, provided they don't make the gunnels too thin, because the skin can definitely resist too much gunnel compression, but it's not going to be able to pull the canoe back in if the gunnels are too weak proportionate to the ribs. So now that I've droned on for the last 15 minutes talking about how these things are built, whether or not you care about that, I should probably talk about how they're paddling. So I want to start this by saying I may not be the right person to make this sort of an evaluation because, one, I'm not an experienced single-bladed canoer, and two, I've only spent about a half hour in the smaller of these boats in the rain this afternoon. So for what it's worth, my preliminary impression from getting into this boat is that it felt reasonably stable considering where I set the seat height. I could sit on the seat. I could also put my knees under it and switch from a sitting to a kneeling position, which was nice. I felt like it tracked reasonably well and I could keep it on course even with my completely wrong-sized paddle and my atrocious single blade J-stroke. I felt like I could turn it when I needed to. It seemed like it had a reasonable balance between tracking and maneuverability. And I also felt like I could scull it pretty easily from side to side. So take that for what it's worth. I don't think any of that really means anything because I don't have a good baseline to compare it to. But I imagine that if I'm going to do this again, if I do decide to make a larger solo canoe for myself, I'll probably just mimic something like what's out there commercially. So something maybe 14.5 to 15 feet long, around 28 inches wide, with about 2 inches of rocker in the front and about an inch of rocker in the back. So very similar to all of the reputable solo canoes that you already see out there on the market, with the exception of the fact that it would probably be about a ½ inch to an inch shallower, and it's not going to have tumble home sides. So the last thing I want to talk about before I go here doesn't actually have to do with what these canoes are or even how they're paddling. It has to do with where they're going, because the whole reason I decided to build these two canoes right now was as a donation for Kyle Roberts and Tom Schellenberg, which are two brothers who grew up together, both canoeing and portaging canoes. And they've launched this venture where they're carrying canoes to interesting places all around the world to raise awareness for mental health issues. And how I got involved with this is I heard about their campaign. I thought it was a great idea, and I wanted to support them because of how seriously they're taking the whole thing and also how much money they've already been able to raise. Because the next place that these boats are going to go is they're going to get packed in a crate, and then they're going to be shipped to Kathmandu, Nepal, where they're going to be met by Kyle and Tom, who are going to carry them over 125 miles over a period of 20 days, all the way up to 17,000 feet at the Everest Base Camp, which is not just a strange and ridiculous and interesting thing to do, it's also a really important thing to do, because in addition to raising awareness for mental health, they're also donating all of the profits from this entire venture to a women's mental health transit center in Kathmandu, Nepal, where women that are experiencing mental health issues and are experiencing homelessness can go and get care and treatment to help them get off the streets and back into society. So I'm really passionate about mental health issues in general, and also just compassion and love and helping other human beings. So I wanted to throw my donation into the hat, give them these canoes, help them on their journey. And if you want to help Kyle and Tom out, consider checking out their website, which is called The Weight We Carry. I'll leave a link to it down below and also on my website, and maybe make a donation of your own, because for a surprisingly small amount of money, you can make a huge difference in the life of someone who might not otherwise have any opportunity to get out of a difficult situation. So make sure you check that out. I'm going to get these canoes out of the living room here. I'm going to start on another canoe, keep working on the video courses, keep working on the plans, and hopefully within another month here, probably sometime around the beginning of November, we're going to be still on course to launch the video and plan sets, or at least a beta version. So stay tuned for that. I'll keep you posted. Keep your eyes on the channel, and I will see you next time.